Now we're going to talk about the Puritans. And before we do that, we have to have a little context. My family always gets a frightened look on their face when I say that word context because they sense a ramble coming on. But we have to at least briefly cover some things leading up to the formation of the Puritans. And Puritanism really started, well, the foundations of Puritanism, with the Protestant Reformation. And the Protestant Reformation started in 1517 when the German priest and a theology professor Martin Luther nailed his 95 theses to the door of that church. These theses that protested various things, particularly the sale of indulgences of the Catholic Church. Now, before this point, 99.9% of people in Europe who considered themselves to be, well, Western Europe, I guess. You had Eastern Orthodox. But anyway, the vast majority of people in Europe who considered themselves to be Christian were either Eastern Orthodox over in Greece and Russia and so forth, or they were part of the Catholic Church. The church was the church, except for an occasional, perhaps a group of people that were regarded as infidels that rose up that questioned certain things about the Catholic Church, and those were usually very quickly and often very bloodily suppressed. However, Martin Luther started a chain reaction. He was a spark that started a forest fire that led to large numbers of people in Europe protesting the Catholic Church and eventually breaking away and forming new denominations of Christianity that were called Protestant because they had started off with their protest of Catholicism. Now, in some cases, this was a matter of individuals choosing to join these new denominations. In some cases, whole countries joined Protestant denominations, usually because their monarch decided to, and that meant that everyone in the country had to do what the monarch said. And that's what happened in England in 1534 with King Henry VIII, who was a perfectly good Catholic until the Pope told him he couldn't get divorced and get married for the umpteenth time. And he sort of took umbrage at that and said, well, fine, I'll just have my own church. And so England broke away from the Catholic Church, and Henry VIII established the Church of England, which, still kept some of the aspects of Catholicism. This is what's now known as Anglican or Episcopalian congregations, the Church of England. They still kept what's known as high liturgy. They still had robes. They even had priests, but the priests could get married. And they had a lot of the ritual, but a lot of substantial changes as well, not the least of which was breaking away from Rome. Now, this led to a lot of problems over the years in the British Isles because the king decides he's going to be a new religion, and that means everyone else has to be, doesn't mean everyone else wanted to be. There were still loyal Catholics, and for most of the ensuing couple of decades, a couple of centuries, they had to stay hidden in their worship. All right, so Church of England, alias the Anglican, or later in America, Episcopalian Church, the official church of England from that point forward. And that brings us to the Puritans. The Puritans were English people, mostly not members of the nobility, although some number of them were, but this was especially common or popular with the common people. English Protestants who felt like the Church of England didn't change enough from the Catholic Church. It was still too close to being the Catholic Church in its form. They wanted to reject the Catholic approach completely. And they felt the Church of England didn't go far enough, and therefore they wanted to purify the Church of England. And this is how these Protestants who protested the Catholic Church became Puritans, because they wanted to purify the Church of England from any Catholic influences. Well, some particular beliefs of the Puritans. Puritans believed that the congregation was the seat of authority. There was no need for an intercessor between you and God. So each local congregation made its own decisions. There should not be some centralized governing religious body, such as the Vatican and the Catholic Church, or such as really the framework of the Church of England, which had archbishops and bishops and priests. No need for an intercessor. You can deal directly with God yourself as an individual. You don't need saints or angels to do it for you, and you don't need clergy to do it for you. You can deal directly with God. There was a very strong emphasis among Puritans of moving away from ritual and moving closer to sermons. So the Puritans' worship practice had a minister who was not like a priest, but was a minister, who would stand there and lecture you, give you a sermon for a length of time, and that was the focus of the religious meeting, not the various rituals that the Catholic Church participated in, and which the Anglican Church did as well. Now, in particular, the Puritans were strongly influenced by John Calvin, whose real name was Jean Calvin. He was Swiss. Of course, English are going to say things in an English way, so let's just call him John Calvin. Calvinism, among other things, has a powerful belief in predestination. That is, your destiny is set. God knows whether you're going to heaven or hell. He knows it right now. There's nothing you can possibly do to change your future. But fortunately for you, you don't know what that future is. So you have to just hope that it's the good one. So people are divided between the elect, that is, those special people who are going to heaven, and the damned, the ones who are going to be consigned to burn in the fires of hell forever. One particular thing about Puritans is that they were humans, right? So they wanted to know where they were going to end up. And even more importantly, perhaps they wanted their neighbors to know. So Puritans believed that if you worked really, really hard and you were blessed by God materially, that was evidence you were of the elect. God's not going to be blessing you if you're going to be going to hell anyway. So the harder you work, the more you have, the more God must love you. At least that's what you want your neighbors to think. So Puritans also were extremely strict, very strict, had a lot of zeal for their approach, and very little, and by little I mean absolutely no, tolerance for any other approach. For example, I'll just give you an example of the kind of things that Puritans didn't like. Christmas. Christmas was had too many pagan elements associated with it, like evergreen trees, for example, which were sacred to the old Germanic peoples, the pagan peoples, because these are trees that don't die in the winter. How does that? Where is that in the Bible? Why, nowhere. And also, Christmas means parties, and so parties, that's bad anyway. Dancing, that's bad. Not allow any of this stuff. You're going to be serious. So, perhaps not surprisingly, everybody didn't like Puritans. And that brings us to the situation by the early 1600s. By the early 1600s, Puritans were in some cases being persecuted by their neighbors in England. And we're going to focus on a particular group of Puritans from the originally from the village of Scrooby in Nottinghamshire. That was led by a pastor named William Bradford. They were even more strict than other Puritans. And eventually things got so hot for them in England that they had to leave the country, and they traveled to Amsterdam, to the Netherlands, to worship. That's a place they'd be free to worship the way they wanted to. Unfortunately, everyone there speaks Dutch, and these folks didn't know that much Dutch, didn't know that much about Dutch culture. They wanted their own place. So eventually, William Bradford and his followers were able to get a land grant in the New World. And so they set out from Amsterdam to travel to the New World and have their own community, their own faith-based community. Now, they started off as Puritans. Now they were called, well, later on the name was applied to them, Pilgrims. Now, a pilgrim is someone who goes on a pilgrimage, right? There's someone who journeys, who makes a holy journey. So they kind of gave up on the idea of purifying the English church. It's too far gone. So they're just going to be pilgrims and leave and go someplace new and set up their own sort of small theocracy. And that's what led eventually to them landing at Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts in 1620 and establishing the Plymouth Bay Colony. So those were pilgrims. Remember, not all Puritans were pilgrims, but all pilgrims were Puritans, and they weren't really called pilgrims at the time. That name came later. So we've all heard at least some version of this story before, particularly the part where the pilgrims wanted to have religious freedom. Now we've got to stop for a second and ask ourselves, what did religious freedom mean to the pilgrims? Did it mean a belief in the overall just sort of idea that everyone should have the freedom to worship as they chose? No, they did not believe in that. They believed they needed to have the freedom to worship the way they chose. And if you happen to come live in their community, you'd better worship the way they did, or you're going to be in serious trouble. They were not tolerant of other viewpoints at all, as we shall see. About 10 years after that, another colony was established north of Plymouth, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was actually much larger. And that was established by Puritans who were not part of the William Bradford Pilgrim group, and had some investors back home who thought that this could eventually lead to making some money. But everyone involved was still, almost everyone involved, was still a Puritan and still had these kinds of ideas. Eventually, I think in 1691, the two colonies combined. Now, by the way, back home in England, things changed where the Puritans were concerned after these groups left. By the point the Massachusetts Bay Colony was established in 1630, Puritans were gaining a lot of headway in England. They'd had a lot of converts. They'd become a popular movement. More and more people were frustrated with the king at that time, King Charles I, frustrated with the king and his way of doing things that they viewed as oppressive. And this is going to lead to Puritans getting involved in politics. Imagine that. And many of them getting elected to Parliament, at which point they sort of engineered a coup and started a rebellion, a civil war that lasted throughout most of the decade of the 1640s, a war between Puritans and their supporters and the supporters of the king, who were also called Loyalists or Tories because they supported the king. By the way, the common hairstyle at that time for men, particularly among the nobility, was to have long, luxurious hair. However, these mostly commoners and farmers who joined the Puritan movement wanted to live more simply, dress more simply, and appear more simple. So they cut their hair short. And therefore, the nickname that people gave to the Puritans was Roundheads, because they just look weird. Their heads are like perfectly round because their hair's cut short. Who's ever heard of a guy going around like that, right? The supporters of the king, who were known as the Cavaliers, or the Knights, the nobility, still had those long, luxurious locks. What ultimately ended up happening there is that the Puritans won the Civil War, and King Charles kind of lost his head, literally, because they chopped it off. And his son and heir, Prince Charles, made his escape to France, and then the Puritans ran the country in the 1640s, led by the, essentially a religious dictator, Oliver Cromwell, whose official title was Lord Protector of England. So the Puritans, remember, they left, the Pilgrims left because they were persecuted. By the 1640s, the shoe's on the other foot. Puritans are persecuting people back in England. And in fact, they banned Christmas, closed down all the theaters, banned the sale of any books that weren't either the Bible or about the Bible, and so forth. And fairly quickly, the common people who were just ticked off at the king and had supported the Puritans came to the conclusion, man, these guys are no fun at all. And so their rule didn't last long. Eventually, Charles II, who had managed to escape, was asked by the English people to come back and retake the throne. So anyway, that's the background of Puritans, and that's how Pilgrims who were Puritans, and then later Puritans who were not Pilgrims, started these two colonies that later merged into one colony. Now, if you're familiar with the story of the Pilgrims and Plymouth Rock, you will know that they were greeted by a Native American named Squanto, right? And Squanto was very friendly and very helpful, and he taught them all kinds of tricks to survive the winter and ways to plant their crops so that they would thrive and they wouldn't starve to death, which was very nice of him. Now, a lot of you may know that story. You may not know the full story of this guy, Squanto. His name was actually Tisquantum, and he was a member of the Patuxet tribe. The Patuxet were a part of the Wampanoag Federation. The Wampanoag were the most powerful tribe in New England, and they kind of had alliances with lesser tribes that came under their wing. So that's where Squanto was from. Have you ever wondered, when you hear these stories about Squanto, how he was able to teach them all these things? How he was able to communicate with them? Well, I mean, he just talked to them in English. Now, the way that the story of the arrival of the Pilgrims usually works is that they were the very first settlers, which they weren't, of course. Roanoke and Jamestown came before the Plymouth colony and the Pilgrims. But Squanto, or Tisquantum, spoke really good English, and he was able to teach them all these things. That's because he had lived in England. This is another thing that most folks don't realize or not aware of. Even before the Pilgrims landed in 1620, English ships had been going up and down the Atlantic coast. Jamestown was established in 1607. So going up and down the coast, fishing vessels, trading vessels primarily. And these trading vessels, every once in a while, if they saw an individual Native American, or maybe a group of women and or children that weren't well defended, why, they would jump out of their ships and grab those people and capture them and take them back across the ocean to sell them as slaves. And that's what happened to Tisquantum, alias Squanto. He was kidnapped by English sailors in 1614, 6 years before the Pilgrims showed up, taken to England, where he lived as a slave. He eventually was able to get support from some people whom he met there that helped him to raise the money to buy his freedom, at which point he wanted to go home. But you couldn't just buy a ticket to New England because there wasn't a New England yet. So he actually got a job as a sailor and worked his way across the Atlantic Ocean back to North America. And finally, in 1619, 5 years after he had been kidnapped, he got back to his home village only to find that everyone there was dead because there had been a smallpox epidemic. All it took was just a handful of Indians being exposed to English sailors who carried smallpox for it to spread like wildfire all up and down the coast. So his whole tribe essentially had been wiped out. Therefore, since his tribe had been part of the Wampanoag Confederacy, he joined himself to the larger Wampanoag group. And when the Pilgrims showed up and the the chief Massasoit of the Wampanoags wanted to communicate with them, people were like, hey, here's this guy to Squantum. He speaks their language. He's been there. We'll send him. And so they did. And that's how he was able to talk with them. Not quite, a little more involved, perhaps, than the way you've heard the story. And this picture shows the one trick that he showed them that we've probably all heard about in elementary school, which is that you bury a fish at the base of the corn plant or other plants that will fertilize those plants and make them grow better. And if you have heard about that, then you've probably been told he was teaching them an Indian trick. Indians didn't do that. That wasn't an Indian trick. That was an Italian trick, actually, that Squanto had learned when he was living in England from an Italian sailor. And so he brought that idea back. So all very different from how it's been presented. Also, you may not be aware of Squanto's ultimate fate. Eventually, the Pilgrims began to suspect he wasn't being straight with them, that he was the only one that spoke both languages. They weren't sure if he was conveying what they were saying accurately, and neither was the Wampanoag chief Massasoit, who came to suspect that Squanto was actually just kind of switching things around in translation so as to benefit himself and be able to get a lot of material things from both sides, kind of playing both sides against the middle. So they killed him. He died mysteriously, and there is every indication, and I think that more evidence has been found in the records in recent years that this is so, that he was poisoned by the Wampanoag people, at perhaps the command of the Wampanoag leader. So they don't tell you that in kindergarten at the Thanksgiving festival because that's kind of a downer. But that is what happened. That's what happened, and at this point now, the native people of New England are going to be dealing, from this point forward, with these new settlers who have a completely different way of looking at almost everything than they do. One more thing, though, before I stop talking about Squanto. Remember how I said that he returned to his village finally after being gone for 5 years, his village among the Patuxet Band, and discovered that everyone was dead. That was a fairly common thing in Indian towns and villages throughout New England, in which the whole group would have died from smallpox or some other disease, or in some cases, almost the whole group died, and the few survivors went and joined someone else. So this means that their crops, remember they are agricultural, their crops didn't get planted. So when the Pilgrims and other Puritan groups would arrive, they would find whole areas cleared and waiting to be farmed, almost like it was waiting for them there. And their interpretation was this was God preparing the way. This is proof. God was with them because their farmland had already been cleared and was waiting. When in reality, it was a matter of the Indians who had prepared that land died before they could plant it, before they could use it. And eventually the Puritans figured that out, but they figured that was God too, clearing the people as well as the land for the Puritans to be able to come in and take over. So this is known as widowed land. That's what widowed land is. Land that was farmed and prepared by the local native population who then died off. And so that prepared land was just sitting there waiting for the English colonists when they arrived. So, English colonists. Let's get back to talking about them. We're talking, of course, about the Pilgrims who landed in 1620. Now, they had very different reasons for establishing a colony, whereas the Jamestown colony was set up by a company and was primarily designed to produce profit. And the common folk, the indentured servants that came across to Jamestown were viewed as one investor put it as the manure that would grow their empire. The Pilgrims were coming to establish their own religious communities, which they were not able to do at that time openly in England, although that would change within just a few years back in England. So, anyway, they also have slightly different relations for slightly different reasons with the local Indians. Now, in Jamestown, there was some conflict at first with the Powhatan tribe. Gradually, over a few years, that was sort of worked out. Trade was developed. What's going to happen with the Pilgrims? Well, let's take a look at one Pilgrim in particular. William Bradford was one of the early Pilgrim leaders, and in fact was the second governor of the new colony of Plymouth. Several years later, he wrote a book called The History of Plymouth Plantation, or Colony. It's like planting people, which gave the history of the first quarter century or so of that colony. And what I want to do now is share with you an excerpt from his book there about the early years of the colony, the part where he describes what was awaiting them when they landed at Plymouth Rock. Now, bear in mind, these folks were landing in New England in autumn. Okay? So, here's what he had to say. Bold parts are mine. They weren't bolded in the original. Here's what he said. Besides, what could they see but a hideous and desolate wilderness full of wild beasts and wild men? And what multitudes there might be of them they knew not. Neither could they, as it were, go up to the top of Pisgah to view from this wilderness a more goodly country to feed their hopes. Now, let's have a little Sunday school review. If you are not familiar with Pisgah, Mount Pisgah, that's the big mountain on the edge of the Promised Land where Moses, the elderly and dying Moses, was taken by God so that he could at least see the Promised Land, which he wasn't going to be able to enter. Okay? So Bradford is saying, we did not even have a Pisgah to stand on and look out and see some promised land, some promise of any kind of good land. For which way soever they turned their eyes, save upward to the heavens, they could have little solace or content in respect of any outward objects. for summer being done. All things stand upon them with a weather-beaten face, and the whole country, full of woods and thickets, represented a wild and savage hue. Oh my God, we got here and summer's over, it's autumn, what a desolate wasteland New England is. Well, to him it was. To the Pilgrims, it was, because their view of nature was that it should be dominated by man, that it should be controlled, that it should be transformed, not chaotic and just doing whatever it wants, which is what was going on there. And then the people living in the woods, the Indians, according to the viewpoint of the Pilgrims, they were chaotic as well, just doing whatever they wanted, under no form of godly spiritual control, at least not that the Pilgrims recognized. So, it sounds like they got dropped down in the middle of Death Valley, but we know, at least from the way we look at things, that it's a beautiful, beautiful area. Would have been more so then. Well, that is one way of looking at things. All English people weren't Pilgrims or Puritans and didn't all look at things necessarily quite that same way. Now, shortly after the establishment of the Plymouth colony, 2 or 3 years later, another Englishman moved into the neighborhood. His name was Thomas Morton. He was a supporter of the king. Now, there was already starting to be conflict, tension in England between the Puritans and the king that would lead by 1640 to civil war. So he was a royalist. He was a good friend of Ben Jonson, and if that name is not familiar to you, Ben Jonson, along with Christopher Marlowe and William Shakespeare, were the preeminent playwrights in London at that time. Now, he was not a Puritan. He was about as far from being a Puritan as you could get. And not only that, he didn't like Puritans at all. And that's all because, well, his stepson, his wife's grown son, was a Puritan and converted his mother to Puritanism, and that's when all fun ended at Thomas Morton's house. Thomas Morton, kind of a typical Englishman of the time, he liked to go down to the pub and have a pint. He liked to have a good time. He liked to dance. He enjoyed Christmas, things like that, pagan stuff that his wife wanted nothing to do with, and there were so many arguments that they wound up separating and getting divorced. Actually, I don't know that they ever got divorced, but they certainly separated. So, he had a strong dislike for Puritans. He believed they should mind their own dadgum business. He set up shop not far from the settlement there at Plymouth and set up a trading post, essentially, on this high hill that he named Marymount, because he intended for it to be a fun place. So there at Thomas Morton's station, if you were to drop in, why, you would see sailors, because English ships from well before the establishment of Jamestown, English ships had been going up and down the coast and trading with the native peoples or fishing. So you might see some English sailors hanging out there. You might see some members of the local tribes, because Morton really thought highly of Native American culture. He thought that there was a lot that the English could learn from the Indians, particularly in their interaction with nature. Pilgrims weren't real big on interaction with nature unless it was to control it. Well, he started having regular parties there at Marymount, And again, if you were to just drop in during one of these parties, you would see people drinking and even, heaven forbid, dancing. And by people, I mean English sailors, yes, traders, and also local native people, including women. All of them dancing together at the same time. Heaven forbid. So then Morton did what the Pilgrims regarded as essentially the last straw. He erected a maypole there at Marymount. Now, fewer people know what a maypole is nowadays. Maybe you're familiar with the concept. It's on May Day, the 1st of May. This pole goes up. It's all brightly decorated, and these little streamers come out the top, and the little children hold on to the little streamers and dance around singing May songs. Okay? Still done sometimes. My church I attended in Illinois had a maypole, and I felt compelled to explain to them, just in case they were curious, what it actually is. You see, that was a tradition that predated Christianity in the British Isles. It was from the original religion of the people of the island, something that the later Christians would refer to as pagan, and it was a fertility symbol. That's why it's erected in May at the beginning of spring, and this whole ceremony, this whole celebration was part of a ceremony, part of a ritual trying to make sure that crops and your livestock reproduced in the coming months, reproduced abundantly, and people too, while you're at it. So that big pole that's erected and represents reproduction is what is known as a phallic symbol. It's a giant penis. So far as the streamers coming out the top of it that people grab a hold of and dance with, I will let you figure that out on your own. But the Pilgrims figured it out. They knew what this was. Now, Pilgrims, let me kind of emphasize here, Pilgrims were against Christmas because it had too many pagan things associated with it, like evergreen trees. This freaked them the heck out. It just infuriated them. It was very representative of the kind of wild, debauched, orgiastic parties that Morton, at least in their opinion, was throwing there at Marymount. And so a bunch of pilgrims from Plymouth got together and marched on the little settlement there that Morton was running. And they took over the little town, and their intention was to kill Thomas Morton because they were really mad, but they didn't kill him. They were kind of scared to, because he had friends in high places, and was known to be very loyal to the king. So they might get in too much trouble if they killed him. So instead, they beat the crap out of him and stranded him on a deserted island, which fortunately for him, an English ship passed by not too long after that and rescued him and took him back to England. So they tore down the maypole, and they tore down everything, and they renamed the hill, changed it from Marymount to Mount Dagon. Now, if you're not familiar with Dagon, here's another Sunday school refresher. Dagon was the Philistine fish god that the Philistines offered human sacrifices to. So that's the biggest insult the Pilgrims could think of to name a place. Well, this is a pretty interesting story, and it is very illustrative of the attitudes the Pilgrims had toward the native people they were encountering, and toward wilderness, and basically toward any kind of behavior that they did not approve of. Now, remember how Bradford described the landscape. It was just a hideous, awful, abandoned wilderness that just made made the hearts of men just melt in despair from looking at it, because all it was trees and stuff. Well, Morton also wrote a memoir, and I'm going to read a portion of that to show you his attitude about the place. He said, "In the month of June, 1622, it was my chance to arrive in the parts of New England with 30 servants and provision of all sorts fit for a plantation or a colony. And while our houses were building, I did endeavor to take a survey of the country. The more I looked, the more I liked it. And when I had more seriously considered of the beauty of the place with all her fair endowments, I did not think that in all the known world it could be paralleled. In my eye, 'twas nature's masterpiece, her chiefest magazine of all, where lives her store. If this land be not rich, then is the whole world poor." So Morton's reaction to the countryside was probably similar to what most of ours would be. Holy smoke, this is beautiful. This is just the most beautiful place I've ever seen. And far from saying that it was diabolical or absent of God, like the Pilgrims viewed it, he looked at it as proof of God because of how beautiful that it was. Now, this kind of conflict, this kind of dichotomy in viewpoints toward the wilderness are going to establish some patterns that are going to continue down through American history. There are the industrious Pilgrims who have the Puritan work ethic, which essentially says that there is predestination and God already knows if we're going to heaven or hell, and we don't know, but we can't change it. But if we are rewarded materially by God, that's good evidence that we're heaven bound. So the harder you work, the more industrious you are, the more godly you are. While there will be other people who will feel very constricted by that type of attitude and by those types of controls on their behavior, and they will look longingly into that wilderness to the west of them, and will want to go forward and see what's there.